Thank you very much. And so to start the discussion, I'll yield the floor to MP Rampel Garner for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. About this time last year, an article, I believe it was from Post Media, based on access to information records, said that the Financial Consumer Agency of Canada had received 27,323 complaints about breaches of the Bank Act since 2019, and none had received a response. How many have received a response since then, in the last year? Of those 27,000, that none had received a response?
Yeah. If a customer is not satisfied with a service or product from their bank, from their financial institution, FCAC encourages them to file a complaint with their financial institutions.
I have the Financial Consumer Agency Act of Canada in front of me, and it's fairly clear on what your mandate is, your organization's mandate is, including, I'm just looking here, strive to protect the rights of consumers of financial products and services and the public, taking into account the need for financial institutions to efficiently manage their business operations. So I'll ask again, of the 27,000 complaints about breaches of the Bank Act since 2019, how many have received a response? This article was published a year ago. Were any of those resolved or responded to?
You want to take it? Sure.
Thank you for the question. So with respect to complaints, there's two regimes in place.
How many of those were responded to? So there's 27,000. Did your organization respond to any of those after that article came out?
Under our mandate, we are not in place to resolve complaints, but we do get reported.
But did you respond to any of them? The operative word was respond. So you had 27,000 people take the time to write to your agency. How many did you write back to out of that?
The large majority of those are reported complaints by the banks. Some of those complaints are complaints.
I'm asked, so how many were responded to?
Data from the banks that we receive as a requirement suggests that more than two-thirds since 2022, when the enhanced requirements came in for complaint handling.
So again, but 27,000 people wrote to your agency. We fund you. We allocate money to you. We pay your salaries. How many of those 27,000 just even got a file under garbage
I just have to correct.
Do you know? Is it
I
more
have to
than
correct
zero?
27,000
Yes.
complaints.
According to a access to information record, 27,333 complaints received no response. How many of those received a response in the year since this information has been made public?
The majority of those complaints are received by the requirement for banks to report the complaints they receive and how they're handled. They're not all directly into the FCC.
Did you respond to
from
any of
concern.
them?
Where banks are concerned and they report on their reportable complaints.
Can you table that? So what I'd like to receive, and I think the committee would benefit to receive, is of the 27,333 complaints that were mentioned in this, how many received a response and under what circumstances? Can you please table that information with the committee?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. So what assurances, given that that's the, in preparing for this meeting, that's basically the report that we have from your committee. There's a lot of platitudes and whatnot, but there's not a lot of information on when a complaint goes into the system, what comes out of it. So my question would be, what would you say that you do here in regard to actually keeping people safe?
Would you like me to answer that?
Like, what do you do here?
So by way of our mandate, we have three key functions.
No, but like, what have you actually done? Because we have heard, this committee has heard some fairly atrocious behavior on behalf of credit card companies and banks in the course of the study, and we pay your salaries and that of your staff per your act that was created in 2001 to ostensibly protect consumers from this behavior. Yet I don't have a lot of evidence that says that you actually respond to these. So what is your value proposition?
By way of example, I'll speak to our enforcement function to demonstrate the part of the value that we offer. Through our enforcement function, we undertake hundreds of investigations a year. They do translate into hundreds of notices of breaches issued.
And then what happens?
Including some notices of violation. Through that work, all breaches that we identify are subject to remediation, and they are remediated by the bank.
What would be a high-profile example that we could point to for success in terms of continued value proposition of your agency?
Those that are publishable are on our website.
I would like you to tell me. You're here.
I would say to you that over the course of the last 2 years, the penalties issued to financial institutions have been in the millions, and the redress or
Millions, like 1 or 2?
10.
10 is the
10?
max.
Okay. Okay.
But there's also millions
What
of
is a
dollars.
high-profile case that you could point to that would give us like some assurance that your agency is materially helping address some of the problems that have come up in the course of this committee?
By way of a case, I would like the opportunity to, look back at our website to see what we've posted. I know some are in play that I
Like,
cannot
does one
speak
come
to.
to mind for you in your role? Nothing? Anything?
I can tell you
Like, what's
that
on the top of your CV for like a success?
If I could just intercede here for a moment, and I will pass the word to Jason because I would like him to talk a little bit, particularly as the person who runs the client center. But for example, when we are concerned about complaints or statistics showing, for instance, that there might be a large number of defaults on mortgages expected because people may have gotten in over their heads, we have put in place, for instance, the mortgage guidelines, which is a very active, very specific thing to protect consumers in order to ensure that any catastrophic outcomes could be
I'll
prevented.
just close with this and perhaps phrase my question differently. We are looking for solutions to protect consumers from abusive behavior by Canada's financial institutions. And ostensibly, per this act, your agency is supposed to be helping us in that role. What are you doing? Like, I've asked for like a success. Like, that should be a fairly easy question to
I think
answer, right?
The mortgage guidelines is a success.
How?
In that it will help to prevent catastrophic outcomes for people who are going.
Has it done that so far? Has there
Well,
been
it's just-
anything in the past
MP
that you can
Rempel-Garner,
put
I'm
in
sorry,
place?
but we're running
Thank
out
you.
of time. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
I'll now turn it over to MP Badaway for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm going to ask some questions that I just asked the previous witnesses, the Competition Bureau, and they were unable to answer. And I'm hoping that you can answer some of these questions. So question one is, how does the pricing structure of Canada's leading e-transfer providers compare to global benchmarks? Question one. And then question two, are fees consistent with the competitive market practices? I got a part answer from the Competition Bureau, but I'm hoping to get a more complete answer from you folks. So I'm not sure which one of you guys want to jump in, but feel free.
You give it to me, okay. In terms of fee structures, we do not oversee the fee structure per se. I would say that that's something you would have to raise with the Bank of Canada and with the Department of Finance. We do a lot of research to understand the comparative ecosystems, and so we engage with the policymakers, with the departments who are doing that work to share our findings with them, because part of our role in the prudential space is to provide information to protect consumers from a consumer perspective. So we do a lot of research in there, but I'm not actually sure what you're trying to get at.
Parameters. So essentially, what is out there? What do consumers have available to them? And with that said or asked,
So
go ahead.
So if I could just give you a specific example. So when the ecosystem looks at, for instance, how different consumers are treated with respect to insufficient fund charges when a check bounces, it was found that Canada's fee structure was not really in alignment. So this government actually
That's what I'm
has
looking for.
taken steps to ensure that the NSF fees, which is what they're called, are lowered so that particularly the most vulnerable Canadians, who would be the ones who wouldn't necessarily have the fluidity of their accounts available to them and that might suffer from repeated, insufficiency of funds.
And you find what this government has done being fair and equitable to the consumers?
For somebody who is managing a system like this, Do we think that it protects consumers more if we align in Canada with the norms of other jurisdictions? It does help to know where we sit in that continuum.
Do any major financial institutions or service providers that you know of engage in exclusivity agreements that limit consumer choice for e-transfer services?
We manage a code of conduct for financial institutions, for federally regulated financial institutions. And by the way, feel free to jump in anytime because, on day 12, I just want to make sure that my answers are fulsome. So we manage a code of conduct, and the code of conduct is something that we regulate and supervise very specifically. As Mr. LaFranco said, we investigate any complaints against the code if institutions are not respecting their obligations under the code. And that's when we would, for instance, send a notice of noncompliance, or when we might level a fee against a bank that's not behaving really, whose market conduct is out of whack with what the code of conduct expects. The previous commissioners have leveled various noncompliance statements against different institutions, and also have used the monetary penalty options on a number of occasions.
That, and I guess I'll pivot over to consumer impact. Are Canadian consumers facing higher fees or reduced services as a result of anti-competitive behavior in the e-transfer market?
That really is a question for the Competition Bureau.
Okay.
It's not within our purview to second guess the structure of the financial ecosystem. What we really do is regulate the participants to ensure that they are behaving, their market conduct is appropriate, that it is not prejudicing any merchants or consumers in that environment. We are ensuring that information is shared appropriately in a timely way and in a way that these merchants and consumers can understand it. Even, for example, the code requires that merchants be notified of any changes in fees, for example, in advance, and that it be on their statements, and that it be obvious, and that it not be in minuscule print at the bottom. What's important is that people have information, because that's power, and that allows them then to choose their service providers.
Now, on that, in terms of transparency, is Interact transparent about its fee structures for merchants and consumers, in your view?
They are participants in the code of conduct, and we supervise that, if that's what you mean.
Right.
Sorry, what?
And
Did
with
you wanna
respect, go ahead.
Sorry, he wants to add something.
So with respect to fees, when you're speaking about consumers and the fees they incur by way of banking services, such as Interact, e-transfers, our role is to ensure compliance with requirements such as disclosure, so that there's full awareness of the fees associated with that service or other service or products. By way of that disclosure, there's also a need to secure express consent in writing, so that there's an awareness. Obviously, if there's complaints in relation to this, there's a complaint handling regime. So there's a host of consumer protection measures as they relate to fees that we have a role in educating consumers about and supervising entities on the basis of those obligations and requirements. With respect to merchants, a disclosure is a feature, but that feature sits in the code. So in the case of consumers, those are legislated requirements. And in the case of merchants, those are established in the code. And again, disclosure is important.
A segue to my next line of questioning about merchants, but the chair is telling me he's going to cut me off right now. But I do want to thank you for the answers. I appreciate
Thank you.
that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, MP Badaway. Monsieur Savard-Tremblay, la parole est à vous pour 6 minutes.
The floor is yours for 6 minutes, Mr. Savard-Tremblay. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson, and thanks to all of our witnesses, and congratulations on your appointment, Commissioner Miller, and welcome to this committee. Now, just to make sure I understand your oversight activities, you've been asked this question by a number of other members. Now, your agency, are there regular analyses on the competition in the e-transfer ecosystem in Canada, and in what way is that conducted?
S'assurer.
Well, the idea is to ensure that the participants' performance in the code is in line with the code itself. It's not an analysis of competition per se. There are obligations in the code of interest to us. Has the appropriate information been shared with us? Are consumers well informed? Do they understand their rights and their obligations when it comes to the financial ecosystem? Question. Well, e-transfers are included in that. There's some level of oversight in regard to e-transfers, right? Well, yes and no. E-transfers, such as Interact. Mr. Chairperson, honestly, please, a little bit of order.
On the committee table and in the back as well. Merci, Monsieur Sarah-Tremblay.
C'est vraiment, merci. C'est vraiment la...
Thank you. So the Bank of Canada is responsible for regulating Interact and e-transfers. It's not our bailiwick. Now, have you issued any reports on the payment providers? Not in terms of competition. No, that's not really our wheelhouse, but we do have a lot of information on the obligations of all the financial institutions and the way and whether or not their obligations are being met. For example, when the Commissioner hands down a decision to do with an irregularity, some part of the code that's violated, we publish that and it's well documented. And that's what we do in terms of protecting consumers. And that documentation can be submitted to the committee. Yes, it's available publicly on our website. Well, thank you very much for that. Have any steps been taken to guarantee that e-transfer fees will remain transparent, or is that not part of your wheelhouse either? Well, yes, transparency is part of our code of conduct, but it's transparency when it comes to all fees between consumers and banks, even if specifically that has to do with e-transfers, for example, digital transfers, for example. So there is a level of transparency between merchants and regular consumers. And how does the agency ensure that consumers are protected against the emergence of fintechs, for example, and new payment solutions that fintechs offer, for example, such as delayed payments, for example, buy now, pay later, and PayPal, Apple Pay, Google Pay, cryptocurrency, etc., where you pay now, or rather buy now and pay later. The Code of Conduct was overhauled and it has been strengthened to ensure that when there are new services offered, there are new players in the financial ecosystem, that they would be subject to the Code of Conduct and therefore to our oversight and as when we go about protecting consumers. Well, I imagine that given that that occurs, all these payments occur online, it's difficult to monitor them. So in addition to saying that this is specified in the code, how do you carry out your oversight? It must be completely different now that all of these players are online. We have our person in charge of oversight here. Thank you very much for your question. I'll respond in English if I may.
Specifically, the payment card network operators are required to ensure compliance with the code across the network, including all the downstream participants. Our role in supervising them involves many steps. First, by way of example, we review the policies and procedures to ensure that they will enable compliance. We also provide guidance to set expectations on the consumer protection measures included in the code. Complaints is another important feature. So we do receive complaints reported by the payment card network operators. We also receive complaints from merchants. I'll use that as an example to say when we receive these complaints, they are investigated. And in the case of the payment card network operators, over the years, there's been significant complaints about fees and complaint handling. And as the Commissioner noted in her opening remarks, we have seen improvements made in the new code to ensure greater transparency around fees and improve timelines around complaint handling. Those are some of the ways in which we supervise payment card network operators.
De manière générale, avez-vous pu constater?
Generally speaking, have you observed that consumers have the necessary information at their disposal? Are they adequately informed about new methods of payment? And are these new methods of payment subject to risk assessments conducted by the agency, for example? Response. Well, there's a lot of research conducted with consumers directly. Would you like to describe the undertakings that we're making to ensure that there is a dialogue with consumers, Supriya?
Thank you for the question, and thank you, Commissioner. So we work in a few different ways with consumers. So we directly study consumers to understand what it is that they understand and what it is that they don't understand. Based on that, we either do consumer education to help them understand the things that they don't. We also do direct interventions with consumers. So in the last 4 years, for instance, we have done interventions that about just under 700,000 consumers that have led about 200,000 of them to make better financial decisions about their money. And the third thing is we work through the National Financial Literacy Strategy with ecosystem stakeholders across the country who, in turn, either run on-the-ground programs that we partner with them on or run financial literacy or digital literacy programs online and through their extensions. So these are all parts of the ways in which we study what consumers do know and what they don't know, and then try to use those insights, as I said, to inform our education material and also to inform the work we do with the Department of Finance on policy and regulation.
J'imagine j'ai plus de temps.
I imagine I have no more time left, Mr. Chair. Have I run out of time? I'm feeling generous, Mr. Savard-Tremblay. Please go ahead. Well, I understand what your role is, but let me just come back. Well, thank you very much for being generous, Mr. Chairperson, in passing. But let me come back to the premise of the whole question. I understand your role, but generally, have you observed that consumers have all the information that they require?
C'est difficile à savoir. C'est difficile à savoir si.
It's difficult to know whether they have all the information required. In my opinion, one always needs more information in a world where information is so omnipresent. We therefore have a financial literacy strategy. This is an effort that needs to be undertaken on a daily basis. All Canadians, regardless of their age, have a need for financial literacy and therefore for more information. Now, on top of that, our efforts when it comes to consumer-driven banking to provide more information to consumers, that's part of the slew of options that we offer to help Canadians get the information they need when it comes to financial literacy. Thank you. Mr. Massé, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to our guests. With regards to the code of conduct, what is the rate of opting into the code of conduct? Have all in the financial sectors, including credit cards, been part of the code of conduct?
Thank you for the question. I want to make sure I understand it. So under the code of conduct, there are payment card network operators that have signed the code of conduct. The Commissioner identified them in her opening remarks. When
but who hasn't signed the code of conduct?
Who has not signed? I believe there's one entity that has not signed the code of conduct, but their name escapes me, so I apologize for that. But 6 have including Interact.
Well, you can get that back to us. So it's not a mandatory code of conduct. And from that one, what have been the repercussions of that entity not signing the code of conduct? So yes, you can submit that to us later, and we'll make sure we publicize that. And then, is it mandatory? And if it is, what's the repercussion for them not signing it? If it's not mandatory, are there any repercussions anyways?
Code of conducts are codes that are developed with industry, and they secure the agreement of industry and signatories.
Yeah, I know what they are, but they're either voluntary or they're mandatory.
I would have to characterize them as generally voluntary, but with a lot of take-up across all the codes that we have.
Yeah, so they're voluntary. And what's the penalty for not signing on to the code of conduct? So we can't even name the one entity now, if there is just one. There might be others. And then how do you gauge who's and how is the evaluation of this voluntary code of conduct of all the operators that are in it? I'm very familiar with this because I worked on a bill on the aftermarket with regards to automotive sector, which it's a voluntary code of conduct. So very clear to the committee here, what happens when you have one that's outside at least, and then you have the rest. Are the rest equally participating, or are the rest in different forms participating?
I think Jason would like to take this one.
Yeah, perhaps, Mr. Chair, just as a point of clarification, I can confirm that all PCNOs have signed the code. There is one PCNO, however, that does not offer cards or have acquirers that has not signed the code. So for all intents and purposes, the ones that are active within the payment system have signed the code. So all the PCNOs that have acquirers and issuers have signed on to the code. The exchange
so
is...
why would the one be invited to sign the code of conduct, but then you're saying they really don't belong in the code of conduct?
Well,
is that really what you're saying?
The exchange is an ATM network, which is the one that has not signed, but perhaps my colleague, Mr. LaFranco, could comment on how we do supervise those that have signed on the code.
And what is that corporation that didn't sign the code of conduct?
Yeah, the exchange, which is an ATM network.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. So how do we deal with this? What's the repercussions?
The code, the obligations under the code fall to all payment card network operators. I'd like to thank my colleague, Mr. Buzanis, for the clarification. So with respect to the obligations under the code, the payment card network operators have the obligation to comply with the code and to make sure all participants within the network also comply with the code. Our role is to supervise that compliance. We do that in multiple ways. On the one hand,
Okay.
we review policies.
So what's the penalty for them not signing the code?
Just to be clear, by way of our role and our mandate, we supervise compliance on the part of signatories to the code, and that's where we focus our efforts to ensure compliance on the part of the signatories.
Okay, so but I'm asking what the repercussions and what takes place is. Is there an administrative monetary penalty against the operator? Is there a restriction to market access? Is there publicity? Is the decision sent up to the minister? I know that the minister might want to know at least if there's compliance or not. We had the same problem on the right to repair legislation. So there were good operators and there weren't good operators because it was voluntary. They didn't have to do certain things. So what's the repercussion of this particular operator?
I appreciate your question. I think you're exploring what happens in situations of non-compliance. So there is non-compliance that we do discover amongst payment card network operators. We discover that through reviews and assessments we do, as well as complaints we receive. In such cases, there is one of two or three options we could pursue. On the one hand, there is the opportunity to enforce compliance with the code by way of what we call a notice of non-compliance. When we issue a notice of non-compliance, it requires remediation on the part of the entity, and if there's financial harm to consumers, or in this case, merchants, there's an expectation that that financial harm is addressed and the consumer or the merchant is made whole. Oftentimes, it may be accompanied by an action plan in which the prescriptive steps to undertake the corrective action are identified, and we actively monitor action plans in that regard. So we do have enforcement authorities in relation to non-compliance amongst payment card network operators who have signed on to the code.
Okay.
And if I could just
That's
add,
helpful. And could you table with us, I don't expect you to have this now, the decision-making process on that, because I'm looking at your website right now, and it talks about how you can protect the consumer. So my concern as a legislator is whether you even have the powers to protect the consumer. So I'd like to have a rundown over the last number of years as to when there weren't compliance or there were issues from consumers, what were the repercussions, whether it's notice of compliance and reparations were made, in what cases they were done, or whether there was, I guess, pressure just to redirect their behavior. That's what I think is really important for us to get an idea of as to the opting in and opting out. So, just to complete though, this is the vast majority of voluntary code. And then you mentioned about the fines, or you didn't say fines, you didn't go that far, but administrative monetary penalties is the normal fining system related to that. You don't have that capability though. You don't have AMPs that you could do.
So in response to your question, I just want to ensure that there's clarity. If we're talking about financial institutions and non-compliance that we discover within financial institutions, there are enforcement authorities that we do leverage, and they can be accompanied by penalties, financial penalties, where warranted, and they also have the feature of required remediation and redress to consumers to make them whole where there was financial harm. Many of those...
That's good. Maybe I'll just finish here with my time. And I don't expect you to have it here, but I'd like to have a rundown for our analysts to have on cases that happened, and when there are non-compliance and what the measures were against the financial corporations for that. I think that would be helpful for the public to know that whether or not we have the proper mandate for the agency. Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
While we're not actually in the business of naming and shaming those who don't sign on, we do list for the purpose of consumer...
Well, sorry, that's not naming or shaming.
No.
That's actually actually responding to whether people understand whether they're dealing with an entity, whether they're following the code of conduct that's been legislated by Parliament, whether it's mandatory or not mandatory.
I completely agree. No, I completely agree. What I wanted to clarify was that we do list the signatories. So consumers are aware of whether or not the entity that they're dealing with is a signatory to the code of conduct. Because the reason I'm mentioning it is I don't actually love the term voluntary, not voluntary, because a code of conduct, once it is signed, once you've entered into it, it is a binding code. It is something that we take very seriously and that we will actually supervise and respond to any kind of market behavior that's not in alignment with it.
Well, if it's mandatory, why do you have currently one corporation that's outside of it?
Well, they don't actually meet the terms of, they're an ATM company. So I'm not sure that they would that they are really one company outside. The point is that consumers will know which companies they're dealing with, and they will know if their company is a signatory to the code of conduct. That was the only clarification I wanted to bring.
Yeah, I don't think that clarified, because your previous testimony from your colleagues said that there was one company outside the current code of conduct right now.
Yeah.
Yes.
And now you're providing an excuse for that company being outside the code of conduct. So they're either in or they're out. And there is mandatory or voluntary code of conducts. I mean, it's just because you view it if somebody signed off doesn't necessarily make it mandatory that they have to stay in or out. It depends.
Let me just correct for my previous testimony. The entity that has not signed on to the payment card code does not issue credit cards. Hence, there's no criteria that would cause them to sign on to the code. It was my apologies. I had not recalled the fact as to why they were out, but they actually wouldn't qualify to be a signatory because they do not issue credit cards in the way that MasterCard or Visa and others that have signed the code do. So my apologies for that error, but hopefully that clarification helps with your question.
Okay, thank you, MP Massé. Monsieur Perkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, witnesses. When I look at the annual report of your organization, I believe you spent $53 million last year. Is that correct? Mm-hmm. That's a yes. Sorry.
Yes.
Yes. So that's a parliamentary appropriation?
No.
Where does it come from?
With the exception of $5 million, which is from the fiscal frame, the rest is all from participating institutions, from banks.
Banks.
We're
So-
funded externally from the financial framework.
And but that's a requirement that they pay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So the government requires the banks to pay. There are 27,000 and change, MP Rempel Garner, of complaints that were outstanding. Did those complaints all come from the banks, or they come directly to you?
So with respect to those complaints, a large majority are reported to us by banks under a prescribed threshold. We call those reportable complaints. We do get some complaints. We receive some complaints directly into our Consumer Information Center. All complaints are responded to, but as an agency, we are not mandated to resolve them. So in the case of banks, we monitor the degree to which complaints are resolved by the bank to the satisfaction of customers, and the number of which are not to the satisfaction of the customer, in which the customer has the opportunity to escalate to an external complaint body for an independent review.
The government puts in $5 million, mandates the banks to put in money, which of course they pass on as a cost to the consumer through higher service fees or whatever, because that's not an altruistic thing they do. So those 27,000 and change are complaints that came to the bank ombudsman process that you monitor. Is that correct? I'm just trying to figure out whether you're just nothing but a duplication of what the banks already do.
If the committee will allow, perhaps, Mr. President, I can weigh in and provide
Quickly, if you could, because I have limited time.
Yeah, some additional clarity. So within the complaints handling system, in terms of FCAC's role, so of course we oversee the complaints handling system, that of financial institutions and the external complaints body. The financial institutions, the federally regulated ones, also report annually to us on the complaints that they receive. And FCAC receives complaints as well through our Consumer Information Center. So I'm very familiar with the statistic that was shared earlier. And so I think it's important to note that of all the complaints that FCAC receives directly, and so those could be calls or correspondence, that we engage directly with each of those Canadians that contacts us. And so we receive approximately 13,000 contacts a year. Of those, about half are related to complaints. And I should note that a small percentage, approximately 280, are related to areas that FCC actually oversees. But I can say for certainty that everyone who contacts FCC directly is contacted and either replied to in writing or over the phone.
Right, but the banks have a process that's required under law with an ombudsman or ombudsperson to resolve the complaints, and you just get paid to watch those?
We're a regulator. We oversee.
You oversee
the system to ensure that they are responding and that the
And
consumers are protected.
and-
We're a
and if they
consumer
don't,
protection agency.
what happens?
Well, then we can investigate and do supervisory. We can
You
take
admitted you
supervisory
can't compel
actions.
them to do anything. You just then say, hey, why didn't you fix this thing you were supposed to fix? We chose not to.
Well, we can issue notices of noncompliance. We can. I mean, it's an engagement. It's an engagement with
Okay,
the
so we
industry
pay you for
as an
engagement.
oversight.
So
No,
you're
we are
paid
an
for
oversight
engagement,
body.
but
We
you're
are an
not act-
oversight body that's overseeing codes of conduct to ensure that market behavior is appropriate.
But if you're an oversight body, why don't you report any of this stuff on your annual report? There is no
annually.
details of the things where the banks haven't complied or have complied on here by institution.
There- Pardon?
Oh, I was saying that perhaps Mr. LaFranco could add some information on what we do
Yeah, I know,
report on.
I'm on limited time, so I don't see it in your annual report, so if you're going to take 2 minutes to answer that, I can't afford it. I'll move on to my next
I'll
question.
take less than 2 minutes, and I'll say that when we find institutions are not abiding by the expectations around complaint handling, we can compel them to undertake a remediation activity to correct for that. And when there is harm in relation to financial consumers, we can require them to make those consumers whole. So in monitoring the complaint handling processes within banks, we do have the authority to enforce the obligations.
Your third goal is to be the authoritative source of Canadian financial consumer protection information. Have you, and you list a bunch of public policy areas that you've done that. Have you released those papers?
That's Supriyo.
And have you ever done anything on interchange fees? Interact's monopoly? If you're the authoritative source of financial consumer protection and the banks own the
Right.
only
So we-
e-transfer and debit system in Canada and force consumers
Exactly.
to use that without any choice. Have you ever done
So
any
we-
work in that area? Because that's the purpose
We
of
do
this
ensure,
study.
yes, and we do ensure that the fees that banks are charging their customers related to those services are fully transparent and that consumers are aware of what the charges are.
How are
So
you a
that's-
consumer protection agency if you
Because-
don't look, just let me finish my question first. How are you a consumer protection agency when, if you sign up for a transaction banking account in Canada, you have no choice of the service provider that provides you with e-transfers or debits? It's the only one that you have access to is the one that's owned by the banks.
We have choices to use those services or not.
No, you don't.
As long as you understand
No, you
what
don't. I have no
cost
choice of
using
what,
it.
I have no choice. If
To
I go to
use
Royal Bank.
e-transfer or not
Let me
e-transfer?
finish, please. If I have Royal Bank, TD, CIBC, Scotiabank, they all own the one provider. I don't get a choice to use Interact or somebody else. I have to use what they have. That's a monopoly. And you're a consumer protection agency and you haven't looked at that issue?
I'm not the Competition Bureau, sir.
No, but how can you be consumer protection
Mr. Chair.
if you don't look at those policy areas?
Please,
You
Mr.
claim to
Can I
be the
answer?
authoritative source of financial consumer protection information. I don't think you are if you're not looking at these issues.
Appreciate, Mr. Perkins. You've made your point. You're out of time. I'll let the witness answer, and then we'll move on to MP Van Bynen.
Thank you. The role of the Financial Consumer Agency is threefold. It is to ensure that consumers are well informed about the services and the cost of services that they are consuming. We are responsible for supervising the entities that actually provide those services to ensure that they are respectful of their obligations. And when they are not, we have options to enforce and make sure that they comply and that they make the consumer whole. And we also provide what I would call integrity in the system so that the actors like the Department of Finance or even the Competition Bureau, that they are aware of information around consumer protection that we become aware of or that we have researched and have findings on.
Thank you very much. MP Van Bynen, the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
I have in front of me a letter that's addressed to the chair of the standing committee, yourself, and it's from Stripe. So I'm assuming that this is a matter of public information. And there's some excerpts from this letter I find very interesting because I think it was the activities of Stripe that intensified our interest in the fees and the transactions. So Stripe Inc. is incorporated in the United States and dual headquartered in San Francisco, California, and Dublin, Ireland. The other part is, while the authority of the House of Commons and its committee does not extend to companies or individuals outside of Canada, we wish to be as helpful as possible. But the concern that we had raised and it brought us into these discussions was that Stripe was only passing the interchange reductions for small business on their interchange plus pricing. So that there were two categories of pricing, and they were only going to make that available to one category. And they've indicated to us that they have over 900,000 merchants as clients. So the effect and the role that Stripe has in the interchange of payments, in my view, is substantial. So my question to you is, given that we're facing a global marketplace, how does FCAC monitor whether fees charged by Interact align with the values and the costs of service provided?
Do you want to take that one?
I appreciate the question, and I think we were last at committee when the Stripe issue surfaced. And since that time, we have investigated the issue by way of the decision Stripe had made. As a participant in the network, they are obligated to abide by the obligations in the code. So the obligations in relation to notifying merchants in relation to that change and the time period of notification, which is 90 days, is something we looked at. There were two aspects of the code that were in question here. So when considering the decision on the part of Stripe, the obligation to inform merchants 90 days in advance, and then protecting the right of merchants to opt out of receiving services from Stripe, our findings at the time found that they were compliant with the code. The code in effect at that time was the code previous to the current code that recently came into effect. But we did look at the issue, and we did speak with the market, with the payment card network operator in question. And
coming back to that, and how does FCAC ensure compliance with the code of conduct? What type of monitoring activities do you undertake? And how do you do that in a global environment?
So I can tell you that with respect to the code, there are several things we do. They range from promoting compliance with the code through to enforcing any non-compliance with the code. And in between those two bookmarks or bookends would be our role in reviewing all the policies and procedures that are to cascade throughout the network to ensure they're compliant with the obligations. We also require mandatory reporting. For example, we receive all complaints that merchants have made to participants within the network. Those complaints can trigger conversations with payment card network operators to understand their materiality and severity, and they can also trigger an investigation on the part of FCAC.
Maybe you could give an example, like Decision 126?
Right. So on our website, there is a decision in relation to a breach as it related to the code, which we subsequently conveyed in a bulletin of expectations for code participants, and essentially requires payment card network operators to be proactive in ensuring compliance with the code, to be report to us on a timely basis any issues in relation to potential non-compliance. It also requires them to document and maintain evidence to demonstrate actions taken to ensure compliance with the code. So that would be an example of where our supervision translated into an enforcement action, which we call a notice of non-decision on the part of the commissioner, and then translated into requirements to ensure that non-compliance does not occur again.
Okay. So we'd heard earlier there were something like 27,000 complaints that were received, and I'd heard also that you have the banks report to you the complaints that they have. Now, to what extent do you authenticate or audit the reporting processes of the banks? Your operating costs are covered by the banks, and you're receiving information provided to you by the banks. It's almost like leaving Nero in charge of the gas pumps. I'm just wondering, how do you audit and authenticate the information you're getting?
Yep.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I can say to you that we do have mandatory reporting requirements for financial institutions, of which one type is complaints-related reporting. The complaints we receive is one piece of intelligence that informs our risk assessment of where risks might lie within the financial institutions themselves. Where we feel the risks are significant or material, we may engage in multiple activities that correspond to that risk assessment. We have the authority to undertake examinations to ensure compliance. We have the authority to undertake reviews of multiple organizations if we feel there's a system-wide issue. In some cases, the issue may be so acute that we move through to an investigation to inform an enforcement decision. So this information informs the supervisory actions we may take across a suite of instruments for which I just offered a few examples.
Can you talk to us about what complaints?
Merci, Monsieur Van Bynen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Tout le temps que vous aviez, Monsieur Savard-Tremblay, la parole
You've
est
run
à
out
vous.
of time, sir. Mr. Savard-Tremblay, 5 minutes, please. The floor is yours. Good evening once again. Now, first of all, we were talking about fintechs. Let's talk about them again. To your knowledge, can fintechs provide financing options to consumers who are more vulnerable that credit agencies, or rather banks, don't offer in terms of options? Response. In terms of banking regulations, or for example, there are financing options if you play with algorithms on our social networks, you can get financing options suggested to you. I assume that there are a lot of consumers that think to themselves, well, oh, this is a windfall. Like some of them would think that, wouldn't they? Why don't I take advantage of this windfall that's being offered to me?
The supervisory perspective on this, my colleagues may want to add something by way of policy and research. So fintechs, insofar as they develop a relationship with a regulated financial institution, the obligations that rest with that financial institution are extended to that contractual relationship with the fintech. Fintechs generally are not regulated federally, and hence, for example, our mandate as it relates to federally regulated financial institutions would not capture fintechs operating outside that perimeter. But again, when they do engage in a relationship with a regulated entity, the market consumer protections do extend to the consumers of those fintechs.
Donc, même au niveau, étant donné que votre mandat est essentiellement un de pré...
So your mandate is to prevent and to protect consumers and to provide information, and in disseminating relevant information, even if it's not a question of an organisation being federally regulated, even if you don't necessarily have a power to compel, you can't intervene in any way?
And for clarity, our supervisory work is set by the parameters of federally regulated institutions. But our work in relation to financial literacy and consumer education can go beyond those parameters. With your permission, perhaps my colleagues can speak to some of the examples of where we've done consumer education or research in the area that goes beyond federally regulated financial
and
institutions.
If I could just add to that, that the expectation, though, around the competitive... Sorry. My mic's not open? Okay, sorry. My apologies. If I could just add to that the expectation also of consumer-driven banking will be a corrective measure in that space as well, because it will open up the information sharing for consumers to control. So I don't know if some of my colleagues, Supriya, would you like to give an example?
Yes, thank you very much. To your point about our mandate in terms of the supervision being limited to the entities that are currently federally regulated, this is correct. In terms of the consumer information we provide, the consumer education we do, and the consumer interventions we do, none of those are limited, and those do, in fact, extend. So we do provide on our website and through our programming information to consumers about some of the dangers of using, fintechs in the current unregulated environment. That's part one. Part two, yes, consumer-driven banking will create a system where the large banks will be mandated to participate in the framework, and then fintechs or credit unions or other banks can opt in. And once we have that within our purview, we will be able to regulate aspects of that framework, which will expand our regulatory powers and our supervisory powers.
Merci. Dites-moi aussi, est-ce que vous enquêtez?
Tell me, do you investigate financial products that are being promoted by financial institutions but that don't meet the public's needs per se? Response. Well, one of the obligations under the code is to respect consumers' needs or meet consumers' needs before a product is being sold to them. Now, we look at how the sales are being conducted by the institutions to determine whether they're in line with consumers' needs and not being oversold. Is that your question? Thank you, Mr. Salvat-Tremblay. You've run out of... Mr. Massey.
Yeah, thank you. Just going to, there's 5 million complaints a year that are filed by Canadians. Of how those 5 million complaints, I think by your own records, you say 76% are relatively simple or there's not much detail on it. But of the ones that are settled that way, are those done with any penalty or nothing? It's just kind of like resolved and that's the end of it? And then of the other 24%, what happens with those, and what notice of compliances have been leveled? And I think that's important to understand whether we have a watchdog here or not, because that's 5 million complaints in a financial sector alone per year that have been identified. That's a pandemic of problems there. And so when I go to your website, it's really hard to find basically any type of repercussions that's taken place with 5 million complaints coming in. You would think that there'd be something here. There's some good information about, if you're able to have financial literacy and you're able to, learn some of these things, you can get that done. But I'm looking at your website here right now. It talks about how you're protecting the rights and interests of consumers of financial products. You have 5 million complaints. And on your website, it's very difficult to find what's taken place with any of these types of issues that have been raised. And you deal with very serious issues, everything from gender issues to seniors and others. But why is it so difficult to find out whether you've done a good job or not on the 5 million complaints and what the repercussions of that issue is? Because that's significant. 5 million Canadians per year.
You want to start?
Sure. So perhaps I can start. Thank you very much, Mr. President, for the question. So if I were to use last year as an example, so in year 23-24, that's fiscal year. So FCAC's Consumer Information Center received just over 9,000 inquiries and complaints. So of those 9,000, approximately 6,800 were related to complaints that individuals might have against a financial institution, and 283 of those related to areas that FCAC actually oversees. So that's not actually to say that we don't provide support to the Canadians who call us for areas outside of our mandate. Of course, one of our roles is to provide them information to help Canadians navigate the complaint handling process, explain that they do have the option to escalate their complaint to an external complaint body. But our role is to ensure that those Canadians who are calling us, of those 9,000 or so, are provided with information that helps them navigate the financial marketplace. Now, my colleague, Mr. LaFranco, could speak to what we do with the reportable complaints. That being said, all of the information that we receive from complaints that contact our Consumer Information Center helps us not only monitor trends and issues in the financial marketplace, but helps inform our supervisory activities.
No, I appreciate that. But what I'm trying to find out is, why is your webpage not identifying the complaints and where they're coming from in terms of advocacy for consumers? Like, I'm just going by a CBC report at the moment that, relates to the investigation that you did with regards to the BMO, RBC, CIBC, Scotiabank, and TD. And it references the amount of complaints. But even if the complaints are down, you go to your website, and if, I'm a consumer looking for rights on this, I don't see anything here that identifies how you protected a consumer and what the repercussions were and what they did. So if I was going to advocate for myself and my family on this, I'd like to know if I've been harmed in any way by my banking institution, what I should expect to get as a consumer, or reparations or something that took place. There should be some way that you can measure it. It seems like it's almost like the real estate industry, in the sense that you have to try to figure out what the price of a house was, at your own volition. But as opposed to this, I don't see what a consumer should expect. Why are there not percentages here? Are expectations delivered in terms of repercussions that took place on some financial predators that have been out there? Because the volume of complaints is significant, but your website just reflects your advocacy. It doesn't reflect the results for consumers.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you want to speak to this?
Sure. So perhaps, so there's a variety of different aspects to the questions that's posed. So in terms of how we develop our consumer information, so it's actually developed in such a way that as a consumer is looking for information on a specific product or service, so let's say credit cards. So if I'm a consumer and I'm going to access information on credit cards, we embed the information on what a consumer's rights are related to their financial institution with a credit card in the section that details the credit card information. And the reason we do that is we have found through both of our research, and this is a key component of our national financial literacy strategy, is that Canadians benefit most from just-in-time financial knowledge. So when they're looking for information on credit cards, we want them to provide them with the information at that time on their rights dealing with a credit card. So that's just one example on the consumer information side. We can speak about it from both all sides of our mandate, though, from the supervision side in terms of what we do to make sure Canadians are protected, but also from a research perspective or from the perspective of the National Financial Literacy Strategy. So happy to expand on that, but just in terms of how we communicate to Canadians where their rights are, it's helpful to understand perhaps how we choose to communicate with them most effectively.
Merci, monsieur.
Est-ce que c'est terminé?
C'est terminé.
Has the time run out? But please go ahead if you'd like to respond briefly.
Just one thing to add, which is just for clarity, we do have data on, like in 23-24, the agency received 260,000 reportable complaints from regulated entities, and we know that they're broken down by the top 5 products or services which the banks reported: accounts, credit card, debit card, mortgage, and investment, and we have the percentages of those totals by subject area. So I don't know if that adds any clarity for what you're looking for.
No, it does help. I guess I don't know, I'm out of time, Mr. Chair, but I guess what's difficult here, though, is if you're a consumer advocating for yourself and you're going onto your website and that, you can't find what you should expect to get as a reparation for being abused. And that's the problem that, I have as an MP is sending people to a website where it talks about all the glory of how they're protected, but it doesn't give you any expectations as to what it's going to be if there is harm inflicted. So at any rate, there's a lot of good information here, but at the same time, you're advocating for Canadians, but there's nothing here that deals with how they can actually get a deliverable for their experiences.
I take your point. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur Massé. Monsieur Généreux.
Mr. Généreux, the floor is yours. Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. Commissioner Miller, if I understood correctly, your agency receives $5 million annually from the federal government and the rest of your funding comes from the banks. Is that correct? Yes, $5 million is for our financial literacy initiatives. That is a highly detailed initiative and it applies only to those efforts. Well, at the House of Commons, we're dealing with the issue of privilege, a matter of privilege, and SDTC. The folks on the board of SDTC who manage the SDTC's funds have allocated funding to their own companies and businesses out of the public purse, and i.e. taxpayers' money. Now, in terms of your financing, there is somewhat a conflict of interest, isn't there? You're funded primarily by the banks. And you wrap them over the knuckles occasionally for misdemeanors or, in terms of the services they provide to Canadians and their clients. Don't you see a kind of conflict of interest there, that the fact that your funding comes primarily from the banks? Response. Well, I don't have an opinion on that. That's the format that's used in Canada and applies to all regulators. And that format is used in the case of OSFI and other organisations. So if you have any questions about that, I think that you should ask the Department of Finance and their officials those questions. They'd be best positioned to respond to those questions. Well, I'm a tad, how should I put this? I'm a tad surprised that an agency like yours that's supposed to conduct oversight and check on how the banks act, that the organisation be funded by the banks themselves. Now, Marie-Ève Fournier in the press in the 4th of November published an article, and it appeared across a number of media, in fact, stating that in some courthouses, CIBC, for example, charges significant fees to withdraw money at a courthouse, for example. And when the issue was discussed with the journalist and the client, the journalist had recorded the conversation. The bank responded that it was the Quebec government and the Department of or Ministry of Justice that forced the bank to charge those fees on those kinds of transactions. Now, does that kind of behaviour or conduct, is that the kind of thing that you monitor? Sometimes are you seized with that kind of complaint when it occurs for that kind of behaviour?
Merci pour la question.
Thank you for the question.
To this situation, we have become aware of the issue, and although there is a jurisdictional consideration, there is a federal financial institution in question here and a payment card network operator. And so we are currently looking at the situation to understand the facts with a view to ensuring compliance on the basis of the obligations that are currently in place. I cannot say more at this time about our supervisory actions, but I want to reassure you in response to your question that we do engage when we see these kinds of issues and complaints.
Well, in that case, and probably in a number of cases, this is now in the public sphere, and you're supposed to have strategic oversight when it comes to these kinds of things. You watch what's going on in the media, and I'm sure that you have comms staff that monitor articles. And now, when you receive complaints, do you dig deeper? Do you investigate when it comes to this kind of improper behaviour or conduct, i.e. the bank's behaviour towards their clients?
Go ahead. They do it. You don't have to do it. They do it. They told me not to touch it.
The short answer to your question is yes. So even though we see an issue with respect to a specific institution, once we've assessed the issue and understand the risks that may exist systemically, we do take opportunities to engage other institutions that may find themselves in similar situations and may be behaving in similar ways. So systemic risk is a risk that we consider, and we have instruments at our disposal to make those inquiries and make those determinations of noncompliance.
And we do media scans so that we are aware of issues as soon as they hit the media as well, not just through the complaint system from consumers or from banks, but also from media reports as well. And then when we do find that there is a systemic potential problem, the Commissioner will put out a bulletin. We have bulletins that are proactive measures for informing the industry about expectations related to compliance with market conduct.
Mr. Chair, I have a request to make of you. Could you ask Ms. Romanaldo if she took a photo earlier during the meeting? I get the sense that she was, her telephone was positioned like this and that she was taking a photo. I just want to make sure that at these kinds of meetings there are no photos taken. Thank you very much, Mr. Généreux. I didn't see that, and I'm being told that no photo was taken, and she would have liked to have taken a photo of you, but no photo was taken of you, and there shall be no photo taking during this committee meeting. The floor is yours.
I know the rules very well and would never take a photo in a committee. With that, I'd like to thank you, Mr. Chair, for the opportunity to welcome the witnesses. I just want to make sure I'm understanding something. Listening to this conversation, I'm looking at your website. Your role is to protect, supervise, and educate. I understand that your operating budget last year was $53 million, of which 90% of it was funded through the banks. You oversee the banks and complaints from the banks. I understand from a colleague that 27,000 complaints were received, but no one ever responded to them. I want to make sure, because you can understand the optics of this, that we're hearing that you supervise the banks or their compliance with the code. They're funding you. So you can see there could obviously be a perceived conflict of interest. Can you just make sure you're clarifying for everyone? Am I understanding this correctly?
No, you're not. You're understanding what has been said by your colleagues probably correctly, though I would like to add clarity to the complaints, for example. We are not a complaint body. Okay, we are an oversight agent. We are a regulator. We are responsible for ensuring that there is an alignment between market behavior, the way in which consumers are treated. We are not I am not the superintendent of financial institutions. I am the responsible for financial literacy and consumer protection in the financial space. And it's part of the prudential measures that are in place in the ecosystem so that we engender trust in the system. So making sure that customers are treated properly and fairly and in a way that is compliant with legislative expectations and conduct expectations that are established in these various codes, whether it's for payment card networks or whether it's for financial institutions. Our role is to ensure that when there are complaints, they are answered by the appropriate bodies, so generally by the institutions against which the complaints have been leveraged, or if that's not satisfying for the consumer, because you may not be happy at the first level of complaining, you may not like the response, you may feel it's insufficient, there is actually an ombudsperson who is responsible for dealing with the complaints at another level, and it's an independent ombudsperson, as most ombudspeople are. So we did not receive 27,000 complaints. That's a media description, and yes, there was an article that said that, but it shows a lack of understanding of the role of FCAC. The role of this organization is to protect consumers, to ensure alignment with market conduct, and to ensure that the actors are behaving appropriately. So when these institutions receive complaints, that they are responding appropriately to the complainants and that the complainants are made whole. And then we can supervise and protect related to that.
So as part of your mandate, you were also responsible for educating, as you said, financial literacy and so on and so forth. And $5 million is allocated towards financial literacy. Exactly. Because you've received over 9,000 complaints, of which only 283 were something that was relevant and in your bailiwick, would that not demonstrate that maybe in terms of educating the general public on the role of the FCAC and what their rights are, that needs to be amplified a little bit? I'll be honest with you, I don't know if most people know what would they need to do in terms of if they had a problem with their banking or their financial institution. Could you maybe explain a little more?
I'm going to give this to Jason and Supriya, who handle the strategy for financial education. But the one thing I would say is just to remind the committee, Mr. Chair, that there is not just what we do to put out information, because I know you're all referring to what's on our website, but remember that all the materials that we produce and all of the educational components are shared then with 18 networks that have about 500 agencies that then also are specifically targeted at financial literacy in the community at different levels. So I've heard you speak about seniors and about youth and about the disenfranchised, poor or whatever. Those are all agencies that have targeted audiences, and they scale or amplify all the messages that we put out. So our role is really to be a reliable source of accurate information and to obviously promulgate it as widely as we can, but to also allow others to scale and amplify the message. So it's never just about FCAC. Anyway, that having been said, that's the context. I just thought, Jason, you might want to speak to the strategy.
Yeah, I could just one comment and then I'll pass it to my colleague as well. So it's incredibly important to us that Canadians are aware that they have the right to file a complaint with their bank. That's why we have a Consumer Information Centre. Its principal role is to provide information to consumers. We take that role very, very seriously. And even if the complaint is not related to something that FCC directly oversees, we want to be able to provide them with information to help navigate what can be, the complaint handling process. And I should mention that we've just reached a milestone in Canada that we now have one external complaints body. So that actually came into effect on November 1st. Previously, there were two. So this is a significant advancement from our perspective in consumer protection. So this will further simplify and clarify the complaint handling process for Canadians, that after they've gone through their bank's process, if they're unhappy with the result, they can escalate it to an external complaints body. And FCAC also oversees their work as well. And we've just had a consumer awareness campaign with the external complaints body in the lead up to November 1 to promote information on complaint handling. And so that's something we definitely make an effort to promote and encourage. And I know even within the context of our national strategy, we talk about the importance of people being aware of their rights and consumer protection. I'm not sure if you'd like to add anything, Supriya.
Yes,
Thank
that's
you.
all. Well, if you want to share, Madam Ramanado, you're more than welcome. You can go for a last question if you want to.
Well, I'd like to allow her to answer the question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Indeed. So I'll just also say about your complaints piece that on our website, we do detail how a consumer can, in fact, deal with a complaint, where they need to go, talk to their bank, and how the process works through the escalation that this information is provided on our website and through materials that we share with. So it's just to address that point. In the national strategy context, yes, as the Commissioner was saying, it's...
I just want to stop you there, though. I understand it's on your website. I just read it. But if people don't know you exist and they don't know what you do, they're not going to be able to go on your website and go and look and see how the complaints are settled. So my point is that it seems very sort of distant. Whereas I don't feel that there's a proactivity in terms of the outreach to the general public to say, look, if you're not happy with your bank or the fees that you're being charged, this is what you need to do. You're depending on people to come looking for you, but if they don't know you exist, how would they know that, right?
It's a great point. So we're not, in fact, depending on people. So as we said, we work with 500 organizations across the country through whom we promulgate and disseminate this material as well. And specifically, for instance, advancing access to financial help is a key piece that we're working on with a number of different organizations in the country, and that includes teaching people about how to access help, who to complain to, where to go. So it is a proactive piece. I would also say in the context of the national strategy, it is structured to be such that it is a distributed responsibility across the ecosystem because, to your point, we are well aware that we are one organization of 250 people. And we will not, in fact, be able to reach, the 30 million adults in this country. And so we do need, in fact, to work with other ecosystem stakeholders to do it. And the last point, if I may make, is your piece about, is there need for more financial literacy and more awareness? Absolutely. There is need for more financial literacy, and this is why we carry out these programs. But the committee might be interested to know that among OECD countries, we are in the top 5 in financial literacy.
So I would just want to make one point. There are 338, soon to be 343 members of Parliament, and I would be pretty sure that not every single member of Parliament would know you exist. Some do, some don't, and they represent all of Canada. So I would recommend that perhaps you reach out to members of Parliament to make sure that that they know you exist and that they can help perhaps share information with the citizens they represent, because I'll be honest with you, I don't feel there's a lot of outreach proactively to the general public. Thank you. I'm done. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
As it to do.
And I would add that a good chunk of the younger Canadians are much more likely to go on Reddit to find the information that is probably available on your website. On that note, I will now turn it over to MP Perkins, who has a motion, I believe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I would agree with what MP Ramanado said, because I think it would be useful for our constituency offices know that if they've gone through the process with the banking ombudsman, ombudspeople, that we wouldn't have any idea that wasn't the last gasp. But with that, Mr. Chair, I'd like to resume debate on a previous motion I had presented regarding Stripe. Members will recall that I moved a motion that said the following: given Stripe's unknown profit margins and its refusal to comply with the government's interchange fee reduction plan, the committee order the production of all Stripe board meeting minutes related to the Government of Canada's announcement to reduce credit card fees, balance sheet, cash flow statements, and income statements since March 2021, broken down by Canada and Stripe's global operations. If I would put forward, we could probably deal with it quickly unless there's a lot of debate to have a vote to produce these documents. Stripe has not been the most cooperative witness, as we know from the letter that was sent in regards to this study. But I won't go there this time because I think the chair is going to reach out again. We have a House of Commons order asking for specific people to appear, and we would expect those people to appear. But in the interim, I would like to resume this and hopefully get to a vote because it will be very important in this study to have this information, since this is one of the companies that's refusing to comply with the government's claim or the government's initiative to reduce interchange fees. And it goes and speaks to voluntary nature of some of these things and how the voluntary nature doesn't always work. So I'll leave it there for now, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Perkins. And colleagues, you've all seen this motion before because we had started to debate it at some point in an earlier meeting. Monsieur Savard-Tremblay.
Est-il possible de proposer un amendement?
Is it possible to move an amendment? It's always possible. Okie doke. And that will be sent to you in writing in the next couple of minutes. So instead of finishing, and of course I'll be reading it in French, but you'll have it in both official languages. So at the end, instead of having a period after Stripe, there'd be a comma on the proviso that it be available for consultation in the clerk's office by members of the committee at a week designated by the committee, or within 30 days of reception of the document under supervision of the clerk, and that there be no personal recording or photocopying of any sort whatsoever, and that no notes taken during the consultation be taken out of the room. Thank you, Mr. Savard-Tremblay. I don't know if you have any comments to make.
For production of documents that Mr. Savard-Tremblay is proposing to add to the motion. So this is the amendment that's currently on the table. C'est l'amendement qui est présentement sur la table. Je ne sais pas si M. Savard-Tremblay, vous avez d'autres choses.
On the table. Mr. Savard-Tremblay, do you have anything else to say? It's self-evident. Okie doke. Any comments on Mr. Savard-Tremblay's amendment?
I was struggling to hear and talking about this. So Mr. Savard-Tremblay, you're adding that the documents essentially would only be viewable in camera and no information could be shared outside of the committee. Is that right? If I understood correctly?
En fait, oui, donc disponible pour consultation au bureau.
Available for consultation at the clerk's office by members of the committee only for a period of 1 week designated by the committee or within a 30-day time period when the documents are received under the supervision of the clerk with no electronic apparatus or device authorised during the consultation. No notes can be taken out of the room, and I'll send that through to you in a moment if you'd like to see it in writing.
Peut-être pour répondre, Monsieur Turnbull, from what I motion, it's not saying that MPs cannot talk about it, but it's saying that they can take notes. But usually it's implied when it's in camera that you can't talk about the content of what you've seen, as for the Volkswagen contracts. But maybe the text of the motion would be important to read on that point.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's what I was struggling, is to just marry what Mr. Savard-Tremblay was adding to this motion. Can we get it in writing, maybe, perhaps?
The clerk is now circulating that amendment.
Propose parce que
here's what I'd suggest, given that it's 7:07 p.m., and I think we have to deal with the motion, so I think we should release the witnesses unless there's any objection.
Est-ce qu'il y a des objections à libérer les témoins? Vous voulez poser des questions? J'espère que nous allons pouvoir régler cette motion rapidement. Veuillez patienter encore quelques minutes. Je vais suspendre la séance pour 2 minutes.
OK, so meeting resumed. La rencontre, la suspension est terminée. On est de retour.
Suspension's over. We're back. So we're dealing with Mr. Savard Tremblay's amendment. Did everyone hear what I had to say? Any comments on the amendment, Mr. Perkins?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Deputy, I am supportive of this amendment, just from the understanding that generally, I think, as parliamentarians, we can be trusted with parliamentary information that is shared with us. But in this case, we're dealing with a privately owned company, which is different than sort of the general government information that we would get. So I would accept this as a reasonable restriction.
Okay, so I'm looking around the table and virtually as well, Brian, to see if there is unanimous consent for the amendment, and I see that there is. So the amendment is adopted. Yes, you're not objecting to the amendment.
Yes, it's adopted. That's
it's
right.
adopted. So back to the motion, Madame Rempel-Garner.
Just given, and I agree with what my colleague Mr. Perkins said, I will, though, for the purpose of precedent, just remind colleagues that committees do have the ability to compel whatever documents they so wish. That is a right afforded to us as parliamentarians for good cause. I would just suggest, Chair, that perhaps, and I'm looking to my colleague from the bloc for, I'm fairly certain he'll agree to this, but perhaps we could take an hour and have an in-camera committee discussion as well, resulting from review of the documents. In camera.
Yeah, sure. But I mean, are you proposing then an amendment to the motion
That
to
could
add
be
this,
something-
or
no,
you're just an understanding with the committee that we will
If
take that
possible,
time?
yes.
Yes, I think that's a fair request, and I
Okay.
don't see any objection around the table. So,
Thank you.
est-ce qu'il y a d'autres commentaires concernant la
Any
motion?
other comments about the motion as amended? No? Do we need to have a vote here? I don't think so. I think there's unanimous consent for the amended motion with Mr. Massey on line 2. The motion is carried in time, and we have 15 minutes left for the remainder of the meeting.
We can move on to the order.
Questions.
Perfect. So, Mr. Turnbull, the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Okay, great. Back to you folks. Thanks for being here. So I understand that the conversation has kind of gone around, and you had talked about your funding model and the amount of funding you get and the percentage of that comes from banks or financial institutions. But I wanted to clarify, because I think it's important that we all understand that doesn't mean that those banks are voluntarily funding your work. The government of Canada has them bound within law to contribute to the consumer protection work that you do as a prudential supervisor. Is that not correct?
Correct.
Okay, similar to OSFI.
Yes.
The Office of Superintendent for Financial Institutions, which plays a very important prudential role as well, right?
Yes, it's a very common model for the way to fund regulators, is to have them regulated by the industry that they regulate.
That's exactly what I was pointing to, is that this is a
sorry.
very common model, and I think that is important for us to understand here, that there's not a conflict of interest per se, because they're bound. They couldn't, if you said something they don't like, they couldn't withdraw funding from you, right? And I think that's really important for us to be clear about. Number two, I tend to agree with Mr. Perkins in the Interact fee, which is very unusual, by the way, that, with Interact having such a dominant position in the market, that, your disclosure requirements of their fees is not really giving any consumer choice. I mean, certainly people can be aware of what the fees are, which I think is fine. So in essence, that could educate them enough to be able to make better choices. But there's no other option, or there isn't many other options, right? So, and I realize that this isn't necessarily within your mandate. It's really within the Competition Bureau's mandate to look at that concentration and lack of competition. But would you agree, at least, that Interact has a very dominant position in the market?
Really have a view on that because that's not really our role as a regulator. What I would say is that when you are armed with the information of how much the transaction will cost, you can decide whether or not you're going to use the service of e-transfer. It's a little bit like you could decide whether or not you wanted to use a service that is more expensive or a different service which is less expensive. There are other ways, for instance, to give people money, and you could opt to do that. So from our perspective, I don't really, as a commissioner of FCAC, I don't have a view on that. It's not in my purview. What I care about is, do consumers have the information they need to make intelligent decisions and to act on it in the marketplace? And that's really the element. That
I understand, and I agree with you generally, but it's a very general statement to make. If you have no other options, it's no good for you being aware of what the fee structure is if you don't really have other options. In today's world, I would argue, I'm not asking for a response on this, I'm just stating my opinion, which is that in today's world, you can't get by without using those services. And if you have very few other options, I think you are kind of bound to using and being subjected to the fee structures that those companies have. So the fact that they have a dominant position, so dominant in the market, is highly problematic for consumer.
Just add clarity, though.
Yep.
So in recognizing that, one of the actions that FCAC has taken in the marketplace is to insist that the service providers, the PCNOs, the financially regulated financial institutions, that they create a low-cost, no-cost account where, for example, people will have no-cost e-transfer, with no fees attached. So this is FCAC is currently working on this with the Canadian Bankers Association and the financially regulated financial institutions, and it will expand the eligibility for these low-cost, no-cost accounts to more Canadians and those who are obviously the most vulnerable to these kinds of fees. And it will include more types of transactions, not just e-transfer, but all kinds of online transactions as well as electronic payments. So there is recognition that we need to look after people when they are unable to avail themselves of those services.
Okay, fair enough, and that sounds good. I'm glad that you're making that effort. It sounds like a good initiative. I want to go back to another point that was made and clarify something. The code of conduct that we had some debate about with MP Massey was talking about voluntary versus mandatory codes of conduct, which I think is a valid distinction. In terms of the code of conduct that financial institutions and credit card and debit card providers currently sign on to, who developed that code of conduct? Did they develop it, or did the Government of Canada develop it? Who developed it? Because I think that's really important in terms of who's setting the standard for their code of conduct or for their conduct.
Go ahead.
Thank you. The code of conduct was developed with the Department of Finance and the payment card network operators. The improvements made to the most recent code were informed by many insights, of which we contributed some in relation to fees and complaint handling in response to complaints we had heard from merchants over the years. So
if I were to summarize, though, industry did not write their own code of conduct. It was done through a governmental process where they were consulted, but there was decision-making. Sure, they provided input. I'm sure they would. But those decisions on developing the code of conduct were not theirs. Is that correct?
That's correct. And although these codes can be characterized as voluntary, upon signature, the obligations are mandatory.
Yeah, OSFI has a lot of codes of conduct and regulatory requirements and guidelines that are not really voluntary. They're mandatory. Once they're in force, I can tell you the Climate Risk Management Guideline B15, which I was very interested in, went through rounds of consultation, and now it's in force, and all financial institutions have to abide by that now, which is great. Okay, back to my line of questioning. How is that code of conduct updated? Let's say we wanted to hold our financial institutions to a higher standard, and at this moment in time, all of us, I think, around the table are saying, hey, there's some things here where I'm not sure that they're being held to the highest standard. And to me, that's not really your role. Your role isn't to change the code of conduct. Your role is to oversee the compliance with that code of conduct, if I'm not mistaken. So, but who is it up to change that code of conduct? Is it the Government of Canada?
The enforcement arm or the supervisory arm, but the actual code itself and the standards that are set out in that code are the expectations that are set by the policy drivers, which is the Department of Finance.
Great. And lastly, we had quite a lot of conversation about, how you oversee the complaints process. And I get that there's some, almost prodding and poking to say, well, like, what is your role and, why is it necessary? And I kind of get that because you're kind of monitoring that the complaints process through the banks is amounting to either response and resolve, or as you say, you can step in and ensure that customers or consumers actually are made whole. But to what degree do you do that? Like, when do you really throw the book at people and make them, make financial institutions make people whole? Like, that's kind of sounds like you're being tough on, but I want to know how many of the 283 that you're responsible for, or maybe it's the 9,000 number that you cited, but I want to know what percentage of those where you're stepping in and asserting your regulatory authority as the supervisor to say, you guys haven't done your job and we want you now to make the consumer whole.
Yeah, that's a very good question. To reiterate, the reportable complaints we receive from banks are by definitions complaints that have been handled and responded to. And our role is to ensure that they're handled in a way that meets consumer protection measures. For example, they have to be dealt with within 56 days, and the consumer needs to benefit from a written response. In the absence of satisfaction, there's an escalation process to an independent ombudsman that we call the ESB. From a supervisory perspective, we have many sources of intel. Complaints reported by banks is one, complaints received directly from consumers or merchants are another. We undertake our own risk assessments, reviews, and so on, and we interact closely with financial partners. Ultimately, a complaint or set of complaints can point to a particular risk in an institution that might be speaking to non-compliance. Where there is a risk of non-compliance or confirmed non-compliance, we undertake investigative work to determine the nature of that, what the breach is, and take appropriate actions accordingly, which could range from a notice through a publication of a violation accompanied by a financial penalty. Some cases we learn of these things from the ECB themselves, the external complaint body. And there are scenarios where a particular issue in an institution presents itself as possibly being systemic, in which case we will engage multiple institutions to understand if there's a systemic issue. And where we discover noncompliance, we take actions as warranted. To the earlier point that was made, I can tell you that consumers have received, by way of redress, i.e. being made whole, millions of dollars of redress. But I do take the point from this committee that the line of sight on that is maybe something that could be improved, and our commissioner has agreed to accept that as a takeaway on her 9th day on the job.
12th.
She said 12th day.
She counted the
Can
weekend.
I just add, for example, that, the other thing is there's a lot of visibility brought when there's a commissioner decision related to, for instance, in 2022, CIBC, there were complaints from consumers that they were not being made whole, and the commissioner leveraged a monetary penalty of $6.5 million against the bank, and all of the customers were then reimbursed, and that was supervised and also enforced by FCAC. So the gradual escalation of these things, obviously, it's in the best interest of everybody if things get resolved long before we go to a monetary penalty, right? So the visibility becomes obvious when the commissioner does, levy a fine. But before that, there's a lot of remediation that takes place to make people whole.
So just last comment, very quick. Those systemic issues that come up, I would love to see more information on those. But I would also just urge greater transparency and line of sight on those issues as they come up, because I think that's what we're hearing around the table here throughout this conversation today. So I think that, again, I think enhances trust in the role that you play, which is an important role. Thanks.
Okay, well, this concludes our meeting. Thank you very much, Commissioner Miller, and all of your team, and congratulations on the new appointment. Colleagues, thank you for bearing with us for 4 hours tonight.